The receipt was for $14.72. 2 coffees, black. 1 slice of apple pie, no ice cream. It was a flimsy piece of thermal paper, the kind that fades to blankness in a week if left on a car dashboard. But on its back, in the shaky, deliberate pencil strokes of a child just learning to master letters, were 8 words. 8 words that would dismantle a town's comfortable illusions and bring 197 engines of righteous fury to the manicured lawn of a man of God. The preacher locks us in the closet. David Baer. Rostova didn't see it at first. He was 48 years old, a man constructed of 270 pounds of dense muscle, scar tissue, and regret, all packed onto a 6'4" frame. His hands, which could rebuild a Harley's transmission from memory or crush a man's larynx without a second thought, were clumsy with small things. He fumbled with the receipt, his eyes on the waitress, Sarah, who was wiping down the counter of the dusty roadside diner just outside Harmony Creek, Nevada. He grunted a thank you, leaving a $10 bill on top of the check. More than 60%. He was always a good tipper. It was a small penance for the space he took up in the world, for the way people flinched when he walked into a room. He was halfway to the door, the sun-bleached leather of his Hell's Angels cut creaking with the movement, when he felt the faintest tug on the back of his jeans. He stopped. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath. Bear turned slowly, a tectonic shift of denim and leather. Standing behind him was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6, maybe 50 pounds soaking wet, with hair the color of pale straw and eyes the color of a faded summer sky. She wore a simple pink dress, immaculately clean, with a small embroidered lamb on the collar. The dress looked handmade. Her shoes were white, buckled, and scuffed at the toes. She was holding a single stubby pencil, the kind used for scoring in bowling alleys. She stared up at him, her small face a mask of desperate neutrality. She wasn't crying. Crying was a luxury she had learned she could not afford. He looked down at her, his face framed by a wild salt and pepper beard, unreadable. He saw the faint tremor in her tiny hand. He saw the way she held her breath, as if waiting for a blow. He had seen that look before, in mirrors, in the faces of other men's children. It was a look that coiled something cold and hard in his gut. She simply pointed a trembling finger at the receipt in his hand. "Turn it over," her eyes screamed, though her lips never moved. He did. He turned the flimsy paper over. His eyes, accustomed to the harsh glare of desert highways, had to squint to read the faint pencil marks. The letters were wobbly, uncertain. Some were backward, but the message was clear. The preacher locks us in the closet. For exactly 3 seconds, nothing happened. The jukebox played a forgotten country song. A fly buzzed against the window pane. Sarah, the waitress, watched, a damp rag frozen in her hand. Then Bear's gaze lifted from the paper and met the little girl's. In that moment, a covenant was made. No words were spoken. None were needed. He was a man who had broken 1,000 promises, to himself, to the world. But this one, this silent, desperate plea from a child with faded sky eyes, felt like the last one he would ever be offered. A chance to balance a scale weighted heavily against him. A woman's sharp voice cut through the silence. "Lily, what are you doing?" A woman with the same pale hair, her face tight with a brittle, practiced smile, hurried over. She grabbed the girl's arm a little too hard. "I am so sorry," she said, her voice a high, chirpy thing that didn't match the panic in her eyes. "She pesters everyone. Lily, you do not bother people." She tugged the girl away, toward a booth where a man in a crisp suit was rising. The man was handsome, with kind eyes and a welcoming smile that seemed to radiate warmth. He waved an apology at Bear, a gesture of benign, paternal understanding. He was Preacher John, the spiritual leader of Harmony Creek's First Assembly of the Redeemed. Bear watched them go. He watched the preacher place a gentle hand on the little girl's head. He watched the girl, Lily, flinch. A micro-expression, a tightening around the eyes. Gone in a flash. But he saw it. The overlooked observer sees what others miss. And Bear, for all his life, had been overlooked. He was part of the scenery people avoided, the static on the edge of polite society. He saw everything. He folded the receipt once, twice, with a precision that seemed alien to his large hands. He tucked it into the front pocket of his leather vest, where it rested against his heart. It felt heavier than a block of iron. He walked out of the diner, the bell over the door jangling a tinny, cheerful farewell. The desert sun hit him like a physical blow. He stood by his bike, the chrome gleaming, the engine cold. He didn't get on. He just stood there for a long time, the name Bear stitched over his heart on the outside, and the 8 words from a little girl burning a hole right through him on the inside. He knew what he had to do. The law had procedures. The police had protocols. Child Protective Services had caseloads. He had a brotherhood. He had a promise. He pulled out his phone. The screen cracked and spiderwebbed. He scrolled to a name. Deacon. He hit call. The phone rang twice. Yeah, a gravelly voice answered. Bear cleared his throat. It's me. I need to call a church meeting. A pause. What kind of meeting? The kind we don't like to have. Another pause. Longer this time. How many? Bear looked out over the endless stretch of asphalt, the heat shimmering off it in waves. The road that had been his escape was now a path leading him back into the one thing he'd spent his life avoiding. Someone else's war. All of them, he said, his voice a low rumble. Every last one. 197 riders. It was not a random number. It was the total chartered membership of the Hells Angels chapters within a 500-mile radius of Harmony Creek. It was every patched member from Las Vegas, from Reno, from San Bernardino, from Oakland, from Phoenix. It was a declaration. It was an army. The first call was made at 1:17 p.m. on a Tuesday. The last rider would arrive in Harmony Creek at 6 a.m. on a Sunday. They had less than 5 days to gather a storm. Deacon, whose real name was Marcus Thorne, was the chapter president. He was older than Bear, leaner, with the weary eyes of a man who had seen the worst of his brothers and still chose to lead them. He listened without interruption as Bear recounted the scene in the diner. The girl, the dress, the note, the preacher, the flinch. He didn't question a single detail. In their world, a child's fear was gospel. "Where are you?" Deacon asked. 20 miles east of Harmony Creek. Route 95. A diner called the Dusty Spoon. Stay there. I'm sending Rook and Jester. They'll be there in 3 hours. Don't go into town. Don't do anything. We do this together. We do this right. The line went dead. Bear slid the phone back into his pocket. He trusted Deacon. Deacon was the strategist, the thinker. Bear was the hammer. He knew he was a blunt instrument, and this situation required a scalpel, at least at first. So he waited. He bought another coffee from Sarah, who looked at him with a new curiosity. "You waiting on someone?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Yeah, friends." He sat in the corner booth, the one where the girl and her mother had been sitting before the preacher joined them. He ran his thumb over a small sticky patch on the vinyl seat. Jelly, probably. A ghost of a child's breakfast. He thought of Lily. He thought of the closet. The preacher locks us in the closet. Us. The word was plural. How many? Sarah came back with the coffee pot. She hesitated. That little girl, Lily. She's one of the preacher's kids. Bear's eyes snapped up to hers. His kids? Not his, not really. The church runs a sort of home for kids whose parents are in trouble. Addicts, jail time, you know. The Sunbeam House, they call it. Everyone thinks Preacher John is a saint for taking them in. A saint. The word hung in the air, sour and wrong. Bear looked out the window. The sun was starting to dip, painting the desert in hues of orange and bruised purple. Saints didn't have children who were afraid of them. Saints didn't have secrets that needed to be scrawled on the back of receipts. Sarah leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. Sometimes they come in here with him. The kids. They're always quiet, too quiet, like little dolls. He orders for them. They never speak. I always thought it was strange. They're so disciplined. Bear nodded slowly. He didn't press her. He didn't need to. She was an overlooked observer, and she was starting to connect the dots she hadn't even realized were there. She was a witness, and she didn't even know what she had witnessed yet. He saw the headlights first, 2 pairs of them, cutting through the twilight, 2 bikes, rolling in smooth and steady. Rook and Jester. Rook was a mountain of a man, even bigger than Bear, a former Marine Force recon sniper with tattoos that told the story of a life lived at the ragged edge. Jester was small, wiry, with a manic energy, and eyes that missed nothing. He was the chapter's intelligence officer, a man who could find out your mother's maiden name with nothing but a license plate number. They parked beside Bear's bike. They didn't come into the diner. They waited. Bear drained his coffee, left another 5 on the table, and walked out to meet them. The 3 of them stood in a triangle in the dusty parking lot, the only sound the pinging of their cooling engines. Jester spoke first. Deacon filled me in. You're sure about this, Bear? Bear just looked at him. Stupid question, Jester muttered, running a hand through his greasy hair. Okay. Preacher John Maxwell, age 52. Moved to Harmony Creek 7 years ago. Founded the First Assembly of the Redeemed. Before that, he was in a ministry in Oregon. Left under a cloud, but no charges. Financial improprieties, they called it. The church he runs now is his own. Private board, answers to no one. The Sunbeam House is on the church property. Currently houses 12 children, ages 4 to 13. It's funded by private donations, big ones. Lots of wealthy patrons from Vegas who like the idea of washing their sins with charity. How private is the board? Bear asked, his voice a low growl. Jester smirked, a humorless twitch of his lips. The board consists of 3 people. John Maxwell, his wife, Mary Maxwell, and the church treasurer, a man named Stanley Croft, who also happens to be the town mayor. Bear, Rook, and Jester exchanged a look. The system wasn't just complicit. The system was the perpetrator. There would be no help from within. The town was a closed loop, a fortress built to protect its saint. Rook, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was a deep bass rumble, like rocks grinding together. What's the layout? Jester pulled out a tablet, its screen glowing in the gathering dark. He brought up a satellite image. Here's the town. Harmony Creek. Population 2,416. 1 main street. The church is on the edge of town. Here, big new building, pristine grounds. The Sunbeam House is this wing here, connected by a covered walkway. The main chapel, offices, a fellowship hall in the back. Bear pointed a thick finger at the main building. Where's the closet? We don't know, Jester admitted. It could be anywhere. A supply closet, janitor's room, in the house, in the church itself. We're not going in blind, Rook stated. We need eyes inside. All three of them turned to look at the warm glow of the diner, at the silhouette of the waitress, Sarah, moving back and forth behind the counter. She was their way in. She was the one person in this town who had seen the mask slip, if only for a second. Bear walked back toward the diner. This was the part he hated. Asking for help, involving a civilian, putting someone else in the path of the ugliness he was about to unleash. But there was no choice. The little girl, Lily, had taken a risk. Sarah had taken a risk just by whispering her suspicions. Now it was his turn. He pushed the door open. The bell jangled again. Sarah looked up, startled. Forgot something? Yeah, Bear said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. I need to ask you a favor. And I need to tell you that it might be the most dangerous thing anyone has ever asked of you. He laid it all out. The note, the plural us, the closed loop of the church, the mayor, the preacher. He didn't soften it. He didn't lie. He told her the truth, brutal and sharp. He told her what was coming. He told her about the 197 men who were, at that very moment, checking fuel lines, packing saddlebags, and saying goodbye to their own families, all because of 8 words on a receipt. Sarah listened, her face growing pale. She wiped her hands on her apron over and over, a nervous habit. When he was finished, she was silent for a full minute. He could see the war in her eyes, the fear of getting involved versus the horror of doing nothing. It was the choice every person in Harmony Creek had been making, consciously or not, for 7 years. They have a big service on Sunday, she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. A potluck afterwards. The whole town goes. They use volunteers from the congregation to help serve the food, watch the kids in the fellowship hall while the adults eat. Bear just waited. My aunt is a member, Sarah continued, her eyes fixed on a coffee stain on the counter. She always volunteers me to help. I always say no. She looked up, and for the first time, Bear saw the steel under her fear. This Sunday, she said, her voice firm. This Sunday, I'll say yes. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. They would not be a mob. They would be witnesses, an undeniable, unignorable presence. They would not break a single law. They would simply arrive, all 197 of them. And they would wait. They would surround the church on public property, their engines silent, and they would bear witness to what happened inside. Sarah would be their eyes and ears. Jester would be her handler, a ghost on the other end of a burner phone. Rook would coordinate the perimeter. And Bear would be the one to face the preacher. The next 4 days were a masterclass in logistics and restrained fury. Calls were made. Favors were called in. A complex network of patched Hell's Angels, men who were brothers not by blood but by a shared code etched onto their leather vests, began to move across 3 states. In a garage in Oakland, a man named Stitch, a former combat medic, packed a trauma kit that could handle anything from a gunshot wound to a panic attack. He placed a dozen brightly colored teddy bears on top of the medical supplies. In a dusty workshop in Phoenix, a man called Padlock, a locksmith who could open a bank vault with a paperclip and a prayer, carefully assembled a set of tension wrenches and picks. He hadn't used them for illegal purposes in 20 years, but he never lost the skill. In a high-rise office in Las Vegas, a brother known only as Counsel, a corporate lawyer who rode with the chapter on weekends, began pre-drafting legal affidavits and injunctions. He started researching Nevada state laws regarding child welfare, private charities, and the legal requirements for probable cause. He worked for 72 hours straight, fueled by coffee and a cold, simmering rage. They came from every walk of life. They were mechanics and contractors, veterans and bartenders, truck drivers, and even a high school history teacher. Men society had labeled as outcasts, deviants, criminals, and they were all moving toward one single point on the map, a small, self-satisfied town named Harmony Creek, to save children they had never met. Meanwhile, in Harmony Creek, life went on. The sun rose and set. People mowed their lawns and waved to their neighbors. Preacher John Maxwell delivered a moving sermon on Wednesday evening about the sanctity of family and the duty to protect the innocent. He smiled his warm, benevolent smile. He laid his hands on the heads of the faithful. No one saw the shadow in his eyes. No one wanted to. It was easier to believe in the saint. Jester and his small team of scouts, disguised as tourists and fishermen, filtered into the town. They stayed at the only motel, ate at the diner, and listened. They mapped the town's rhythms. They noted the sheriff's patrol patterns. Sheriff Brody was a man nearing retirement, overweight and complacent. His entire force consisted of himself and 2 deputies. They were not equipped to handle a parking dispute, let alone the silent arrival of nearly 200 Hell's Angels. Jester's team identified the children from Sunbeam House. They saw them playing in a fenced-in yard behind the church. 12 of them, always supervised, always silent. They moved like little automatons, their play lacking the chaotic joy of normal children. They never shouted. They never ran too fast. They never fell down. One of Jester's scouts, a hardened man who'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan, had to walk away. "I've seen prisoners of war with more life in their eyes," he'd whispered into his radio. On Saturday afternoon, Sarah called Jester on the burner phone he'd given her. Her voice was tight with anxiety. "I'm in. My aunt signed me up. I'm supposed to be there at 9 a.m. tomorrow to help set up tables in the fellowship hall." "Good," Jester said. "Your only job is to watch. Find the closet. That's it. Don't be a hero. Just be our eyes. Find the closet." It sounded so simple, but Sarah felt a cold dread pool in her stomach. How do you find a thing that is so well hidden in plain sight? That night, under the vast, star-dusted Nevada sky, the bikers began to stage. They gathered at a truck stop 30 miles outside of town, a silent, swelling tide of chrome and leather. They came in 2s and 3s, then in groups of 10 and 20. They didn't talk much. They just nodded to each other, a shared understanding passing between them. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline, leather, and anticipation. Bear stood on the bed of a pickup truck and addressed them. His voice carried in the still night air. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Every man listened with a reverent intensity. "Tomorrow, we're going to a church," he began. "We're not going to make threats. We're not going to break anything. We're not going to touch anyone." He held up the flimsy receipt, now creased and softened from being in his pocket. It was illuminated by the truck's headlights. "A little girl gave me this. It says, there are children being hurt." A low growl went through the assembled crowd, an animal sound of collective anger. Bear let the sound rise and then die down. The town won't listen. The law won't listen. So we're going to make them. We will park on the public roads surrounding the property. We will turn off our engines, and we will stand there, in silence. We will be a wall of eyes. We will let the people of this town and their preacher know that they are being watched, that the things done in the dark will be brought into the light. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his brothers, men with hard faces and harder lives, men who knew what it was to be powerless. There are children inside that building who think no one in the world knows they exist. Tomorrow, they're going to find out they have 197 uncles they didn't know about. And these uncles are very, very protective. Now get some sleep. We ride at dawn. There was no cheer, just a series of sharp, affirmative nods, a quiet dispersal. Each man returned to his bike, his thoughts his own. Bear looked at the receipt one last time before tucking it safely away. The pencil marks were starting to fade. He had to act before the message disappeared entirely. He had made a promise. Sunday, 6 a.m. The first light of dawn was just beginning to spill over the desert horizon, turning the sky a soft, pearly gray. The sound began as a distant rumble, a vibration felt in the chest more than heard. It grew steadily, a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the very ground of Harmony Creek. Sheriff Brody, asleep in his bed, dreamt the earth was shaking. He was not entirely wrong. At 6:15 a.m., the first bikes appeared on the rise of the hill overlooking the town. They came not in a chaotic swarm, but in a disciplined 2x2 formation. They moved with the slow, inexorable power of a glacier. 197 motorcycles, their chrome catching the first rays of the sun, their engines a synchronized roar that was not aggressive, but impossibly, overwhelmingly present. They didn't ride into town. They split into 4 groups, one for each road that bounded the sprawling property of the First Assembly of the Redeemed. With practiced precision, they parked their bikes along the public right-of-way, perfectly legal, perfectly spaced. At exactly 6:30 a.m., as if on a single command, 197 engines were cut. The sudden silence was more profound, more shocking than the noise had been. And then, they simply stood there. 197 men, dressed in denim and leather, their club patches a stark, intimidating sigil. They stood by their bikes, arms crossed, their faces unreadable, and they watched the church. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They just watched. The first churchgoers began to arrive around 8:30 a.m. They were families in their Sunday best, smiling, carrying casserole dishes for the potluck. They saw the bikers. The smiles faltered. Cars slowed, then sped up. A woman clutched her child's hand, pulling them closer. Whispers started. Phone calls were made. Sheriff Brody arrived at 8:45 a.m., his cruiser skidding to a halt. He got out, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He was a big man, but the sheer silent mass of the bikers made him feel small and utterly irrelevant. He approached Rook, who stood like a granite statue at the corner of the main road. "What the hell is this?" Brody demanded, trying to inject an authority he did not feel into his voice. "This is intimidation." Rook didn't even look at him. He kept his eyes fixed on the church. "We're on public property, Sheriff, enjoying the morning air. It's a free country. You're scaring people." Rook turned his head slowly, his gaze pinning the sheriff to the spot. Some people should be scared. Inside the church, panic was beginning to set in. Preacher John Maxwell stood at his office window, looking out at the silent army that had laid siege to his sanctuary. His wife, Mary, was wringing her hands. "What do they want, John? Who are they?" He didn't answer. His handsome face was a mask of cold fury. The benevolent shepherd was gone. In his place was a cornered wolf. He knew exactly what they wanted. He didn't know how they knew, but he knew. That little brat, Lily, it had to be her. He had seen her talking to that filthy giant in the diner. Downstairs, in the fellowship hall, Sarah was setting out paper plates. Her hands were shaking so badly, She dropped a stack of plastic forks. She took a deep breath, clutching the burner phone in her pocket. It felt like a live coal. She could hear the murmurs from the church members arriving. Bikers, hundreds of them. Hell's Angels. What are they doing here? At 9 a.m., the Sunbeam House children were led into the fellowship hall. There were 12 of them, all dressed in matching navy blue outfits. They walked in a single file line, hands clasped behind their backs. Lily was among them, her face pale, her eyes darting around the room before fixing on the floor. Preacher John came down, his public smile plastered back on his face. He addressed the nervous congregation. Brothers and sisters, do not be alarmed. It seems we have some lost souls at our doorstep. Let us pray for them. Let us show them the light of love and not the darkness of fear. His voice was smooth as honey, but Sarah saw the look he shot at the children. It was a look of pure, undiluted venom. The service began. The hymns sounded hollow, the prayers desperate. The entire congregation was aware of the silent, leather-clad army just outside the walls. Sarah's job was to supervise the children in the hall while the adults were in the chapel. Another volunteer, a stern-faced woman named Agnes, was with her. "Keep them quiet," Agnes snapped. "The preacher wants them to be respectful during the sermon." Sarah knelt down. She looked at the children's faces. They were blank, shut down. She saw Lily sitting on a small chair in the corner, twisting a piece of her dress in her tiny fist. Sarah walked over to her. "Hey, Lily," she said softly. "That's a pretty dress." Lily didn't look up. Sarah saw something on the floor by Lily's foot, a single red crayon. It had rolled under the chair. She picked it up. She looked at the wall. It was covered with children's drawings. Happy sons, stick-figure families, colorful houses, all of them anonymous, generic. But then she saw it. Tucked behind a large framed picture of Preacher John, there was a small section of the wall that was slightly discolored. A patch. It looked like it had been recently painted. She walked closer. She ran her hand over it. The paint was still tacky, and underneath it, she could feel faint indentations. Agnes was at the other end of the room, distracted by a toddler who had started to cry. Sarah looked at Lily. She held out the red crayon. Lily looked at the crayon, then at Sarah's eyes. For the first time, a flicker of something broke through the blankness. Trust. Sarah turned her back to Agnes, shielding the small section of wall with her body. She pointed to the wall. "Lily, did you draw here?" Lily gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "Preacher John painted over it, didn't he?" Another tiny nod. Sarah's heart was hammering against her ribs. She had to know. Jester's voice was in her head. "Find the closet." She looked around the fellowship hall. It was a large open room. There were 2 doors. One led to the kitchen. The other was a small, unmarked door at the far end of the hall, next to the stage. It was painted the same beige as the walls. It didn't have a handle on the outside, only a keyhole. She pointed to the door. "Lily, is that the quiet room?" Lily's eyes widened in terror. She shook her head violently, a silent, frantic no. But it wasn't a denial. It was a warning. Sarah understood. The quiet room. A euphemism as sick and twisted as Sunbeam House. She pulled out the burner phone. Her fingers were clumsy. She typed a single message to Jester. "Fellowship Hall. Unmarked door by the stage." The message sent. A second later, her phone buzzed. Jester's reply. "Got it. Stay with the kids. He's coming." The main doors to the fellowship hall burst open. Preacher John stood there, his face contorted in a mask of rage. The service was over. He had seen the bikers weren't leaving. He knew his time was running out. He strode toward the children. "Agnes, take them back to the house. Now!" Agnes began to herd the terrified children toward the exit, but Sarah stood up. She moved to stand between the preacher and Lily. "No," Sarah said, her voice shaking but clear. The word hung in the air. For the first time in 7 years, someone in this church had said no to Preacher John. His eyes narrowed. "Get out of my way, you foolish girl." He reached for Lily. Sarah stood her ground. And at that exact moment, the main doors of the church, the heavy oak doors to the outside world, groaned and then swung inward with a deafening crash. Bear stood there, framed in the doorway. He was flanked by Rook and Deacon. Behind them, sunlight streamed in, silhouetting the shapes of more and more bikers filling the narthex. They moved without a sound, a tide of black leather flowing into the house of God. They didn't run. They walked. A slow, deliberate, funereal pace. The remaining members of the congregation gasped. Some screamed. Sheriff Brody was there, his face pale and sweaty, utterly powerless. Bear's eyes found Preacher John. He didn't look at Sarah. He didn't look at Lily. He looked only at the preacher. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, resonant rumble that filled the entire sanctuary. "You, me, we need to talk." Preacher John's face went white. He looked from Bear to the growing army of bikers, to the terrified faces of his flock, to the sheriff who was doing nothing. He was trapped. The walls of his own sanctuary had become his cage. He did the only thing a coward could do. He ran. He didn't run toward the door. He ran back into the fellowship hall, shoving Sarah aside. He ran toward the small, unmarked door by the stage. He fumbled with a key from his pocket, his hands shaking. He was trying to get to the evidence, to the closet, to whatever or whoever was inside, but he was too slow. Rook, moving with a speed that was terrifying in a man his size, cut him off. He didn't touch him. He simply placed himself between the preacher and the door. A human wall. Bear walked slowly, deliberately across the hall. Every step was heavy, measured. The entire church was silent, save for the sound of his boots on the linoleum floor. He stopped in front of the preacher. He was a full foot taller, a head and shoulders wider. He cast a shadow that swallowed the smaller man whole. Bear held up his hand. In it was the faded, crumpled receipt. "A little girl gave this to me," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She said you lock them in the closet. She said, us." "Who else is in there, preacher?" Preacher John sputtered. "This is a lie, a conspiracy by the forces of darkness. I am a man of God." He looked wildly around, appealing to his congregation, to the sheriff. "Help me." No one moved. The town's willful blindness had finally been shattered by the undeniable reality in front of them. The bikers hadn't thrown a single punch, but they had demolished the town's most sacred lie. Bear turned to the unmarked door. He looked at the keyhole. He didn't need a key. He turned to a wiry man who had appeared at his elbow. "Padlock." The locksmith knelt by the door. His hands moved with the delicate grace of a surgeon. A click. A second click. The lock popped open with a soft snick that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Bear put his hand on the door. For a split second, he hesitated. What was he about to find? His greatest fear was that he would find nothing, that the girl had been lying, that this was all a mistake. His second greatest fear was what he knew he would actually find. He pushed the door open. The room was not a room. It was a closet, 4 feet wide, 6 feet deep. There was no light. The air that washed out was cold and smelled of bleach and urine and stale fear. And inside, huddled in the far corner, were two small boys. They couldn't have been more than 4 and 5 years old. They were sitting on the cold concrete floor, their arms wrapped around each other. They blinked in the sudden light, their eyes wide and terrified. They didn't make a sound. They had been taught that sound was dangerous. On the wall beside them, drawn in what looked like a piece of broken plaster, was a crude drawing of a stick figure behind bars. A collective gasp went through the room. A woman in the congregation sobbed. Sarah sank to her knees. A hand clapped over her mouth. Bear stood frozen in the doorway. The sight of the two boys, so small, so silent, so broken, cracked something deep inside him. The rage he had been holding in check, the cold, controlled fury, finally gave way. But it didn't erupt into violence. It collapsed into a profound, bottomless sorrow. He slowly, carefully knelt down, so he was on their level. He was still a mountain, but he made himself as small as he could. He held out his empty hands, palms up, a gesture of peace. "Hey," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. "It's okay. You're safe now. My name is Bear. We're here to take you home." One of the little boys, the older one, flinched back. But the younger one, after a moment's hesitation, took a single, tentative step forward. He looked at Bear's massive, scarred hand, and then he reached out his own tiny, trembling hand and placed it in Bear's palm. It was the lightest touch Bear had ever felt. It was a feather. It was a prayer. It was absolution. In that moment, everything changed. The spell was broken. Sheriff Brody, his face ashen, finally moved. He walked over to Preacher John, who stood shivering, his mask of piety gone, revealing the ugly, pathetic man beneath. Brody pulled out his handcuffs. "John Maxwell, you are under arrest for child endangerment and unlawful imprisonment." The preacher didn't resist. He seemed to shrink, to deflate, all the stolen power and authority draining out of him. As Brody led him away, Bear gently scooped up the two small boys, one in each arm. They were weightless. He carried them out of the closet, out of the darkness, and into the light of the fellowship hall. He walked past the stunned congregation, past the weeping volunteers, past the silent, watching bikers. He walked over to Lily, who was still standing by Sarah. He knelt down again, the two boys still cradled in his arms. He looked into Lily's faded sky eyes. He didn't say, "Thank you." It wasn't enough. Instead, he made her a new promise, a better one. "You were brave," he said, his voice a quiet rumble. "You were so brave, and you never have to be that brave again. I promise." Lily looked at the two boys in his arms. She looked at his face. And for the first time that day, for the first time in a very long time, she smiled. A real smile. It was like watching the sun rise after a very long night. The aftermath was not swift, but it was total. The arrival of the 197 had been the earthquake. Now came the slow, grinding work of sifting through the rubble and rebuilding. The bikers did not leave. Not right away. Deacon, council, and a core group of 20 men stayed, setting up a temporary camp at the same truck stop where they had first gathered. They became the town's silent guardians, a constant, visible reminder that the world was now watching. Their presence ensured that the investigation would not be swept under the rug. Counsel, the lawyer, was a whirlwind of legal motion. He filed civil suits on behalf of the children against the First Assembly of the Redeemed's corporate entity. He petitioned the state attorney general's office to open a full-scale investigation into the church's finances and its board. The fact that the mayor, Stanley Croft, was on that board became a statewide scandal. Croft resigned within 48 hours. His political career vaporized. The 12 children of Sunbeam House were taken into state custody. They were interviewed by trained forensic specialists, gentle women with kind eyes who knew how to talk to children who had forgotten the language of truth. The stories came out, not in a flood, but in a trickle. Stories of the quiet room, where children were locked for hours, sometimes overnight, for infractions as minor as spilling juice or crying. Stories of meditation time, which was forced kneeling on a concrete floor for hours. Stories of emotional abuse, of being told they were worthless, sinful, and that their parents didn't love them. That's why they were here. There was no evidence of sexual abuse, for which everyone was grimly thankful, but the psychological damage was deep and vast. The closet was the most extreme form of punishment, reserved for what Preacher John deemed defiance. Lily's crime had been asking where her mother was. The two boys' crime had been holding hands. The church itself imploded. The congregation, faced with the undeniable truth of what they had overlooked, fractured. Some left in shame, their faith shattered. Others, a small, hard-hearted minority, defended the preacher, claiming he was the victim of a satanic plot by the bikers. But they were drowned out. The First Assembly of the Redeemed held its last service the day the bikers arrived. Within a month, its doors were chained shut, a court order taped to the glass. The building, once a symbol of the town's piety, became a monument to its failure. It was eventually sold at auction, the proceeds, meticulously overseen by council, placed into a trust fund for the 12 children. The bikers' role shifted from intimidation to support. They organized a toy drive that was so successful it overwhelmed the local social services office. They used their networks to find pro bono therapists and counselors for the children. Stitch, the medic, spent a week teaching the shelter staff about childhood trauma response. Padlock, the locksmith, gave a free seminar to the fire department on non-destructive entry for welfare checks. They were, in their own gruff, unconventional way, healing the town they had broken open. The perception of them in Harmony Creek changed completely. The fear was replaced by a grudging, then a genuine respect. Sarah's Diner, the Dusty Spoon, became their unofficial headquarters. She never let them pay for a cup of coffee again. They would leave $20 bills under their plates anyway. Sarah, the overlooked waitress, became a local hero. She had been the first to listen, the first to act. She eventually left the diner and went to college, studying to become a social worker. Bear and his chapter paid for her first 2 years of tuition. Bear himself was transformed. The promise he had made to the little girl in the diner had been a lifeline. In saving her, he had begun to save himself. He visited Lily and the other children regularly at the new group home they were moved to, a real home with bright colors, loud laughter, and unlocked doors. He never arrived empty-handed. Sometimes it was a bag of comic books, other times a box of popsicles. At first, the staff was wary of the giant, tattooed man in the leather vest, but they saw the way the children ran to him. They saw the way Lily would crawl into his lap and fall asleep, a tiny, trusting weight against his chest. He learned her full name was Lily Ann Peterson. Her mother was a single mom recovering from a severe addiction. The church had convinced her to sign over temporary custody, promising a safe, Christian environment. When she got clean and came back for her daughter, Preacher John had told her Lily was thriving and that it would be disruptive to move her. He'd used the mother's past against her, shaming her into leaving her daughter in his care. With counsel's help, Lily's mother regained full custody within 6 months. The day she went home, Bear was there. He had bought Lily a small backpack, a bright blue one with a cartoon rocket ship on it. He knelt down in front of her. "Time to go on a new adventure," he said, his voice thick. Lily threw her arms around his neck, her small hands clutching the thick fabric of his cut. "Thank you, Bear," she whispered into his beard. "You kept your promise." He held her for a long time, his eyes squeezed shut. "Yeah, kid. I did." John Maxwell was charged with 24 felony counts of child abuse and false imprisonment. His wife, Mary, was charged as an accessory. The trial was a formality. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimony of the children, delivered via closed-circuit television to protect them from having to face him, was devastating. He was found guilty on all counts. The judge, a woman with cold, clear eyes, sentenced him to the maximum penalty: 30 years in a state penitentiary, with no possibility of parole for 20. Mary received 5 years probation and was ordered to have no contact with minors for the rest of her life. On the day of the sentencing, 197 motorcycles were parked outside the courthouse. They were silent. Their engines were off. They were just there, bearing witness to the very end. Years passed. Harmony Creek slowly healed. The empty church building was eventually torn down. A community park was built in its place, funded by the Bikers Charity Foundation. It had a playground, a baseball diamond, and a small, quiet garden with a bench dedicated to the overlooked. Bear grew older. The black in his beard turned entirely to salt. He still rode. He still wore his cut. But something in his eyes had changed. The hardness was still there, but it was tempered now by a deep, quiet gentleness. He became the man the younger members of the club came to for advice. He was their conscience, their moral compass. One day, about 10 years after the day he walked into the Dusty Spoon, a letter arrived at the clubhouse. It was addressed to David Bear Rostova. The envelope was crisp, the handwriting on it a neat, confident cursive. Inside was a graduation announcement. Lily Ann Peterson, graduating high school, valedictorian. Below her picture was a short, handwritten note. "Dear Bear, I'm going to be a lawyer. I'm going to help kids who don't have a voice, just like you helped me. You told me I never had to be that brave again, and I haven't, because I knew you and 196 other uncles had my back. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for turning over the receipt. Love, Lily." Tucked inside the announcement was a small laminated piece of paper. It was the original receipt from the diner, $14.72. On the back, preserved forever, were the 8 words written in a child's wobbly pencil. "The preacher locks us in the closet." Bear held the laminated card in his hand. It was no longer flimsy. It was strong, permanent, a testament, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon in the world is not a fist or a gun, but a story whispered in desperation, heard by a listening heart and acted upon with righteous fury. It is a story that reminds us that evil thrives in the quiet complicity of good people. It flourishes in the shadows we choose not to look into, behind the doors we choose not to open. It wears the mask of piety, of community, of respectability. It counts on us to look away. But this story is also a testament to another, more powerful truth. That courage can be found in the most unlikely of places, in a 6-year-old girl with a pencil, in a lonely waitress who dares to whisper a suspicion, and in the hearts of 197 men that society had labeled as monsters, who, on a bright Sunday morning, reminded the world what it truly means to be a protector, a brother, a savior. They were not the heroes the town of Harmony Creek wanted, but they were the heroes its children desperately needed. And so, we are left with a final lingering question. Not what happened in that church, but what is happening in the churches, the schools, the homes in our own towns. Who are the children writing notes on the back of receipts, their pleas fading in the sun? Who are the overlooked, the silent, the ones we have trained ourselves not to see? The story of Harmony Creek is not just a story about Hell's Angels and a corrupt preacher. It is a call to action. It is a demand that we listen to the whispers, that we look closer at the perfect families, the beloved leaders, the pristine institutions. It is a promise that if we have the courage to see and the conviction to act, we too can bring the things done in the dark into the light. We too can be the ones who turn over the receipt. And we must, because somewhere, right now, a child is holding a pencil, and they are waiting. They are waiting for their own army of angels to arrive.